Welcome to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews. We continue our study of the Psalms with Psalm 56. To the choir master, according to the dove on far-off terebinths, a miktam of David, when the Philistines seized him in Gath. Be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me. All day long an attacker oppresses me. My enemies trample on me all day long, for many attack me proudly. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise. In God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? All day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. They stir up strife, they lurk, they watch my steps as they have waited for my life. For their crime, will they escape? In wrath cast down the peoples, O God. You have kept count of my tossings, put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. In God whose word I praise, in Yahweh whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? I must perform my vows to you, O God. I will render thank offerings to you, for you have delivered my soul from death, yes, my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of life. This is the word of the Lord. This psalm does give us some of its context. The musical notation is a bit unusual here. The dove on far-off terebinths. There is no other such use of this phrase in the rest of the book of Psalms. The dove on far-off terebinth. The terebinth is a kind of tree, so it could be a tune, for all I can suggest. I don't know. It's some kind of a musical notation that the choir master would have recognized. And miktam of David is the same kind of thing, a specific type of song or psalm. But what we do know contextually, when the Philistines seized him in Gath, this is a reference to 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 10 through 15. I'm going to read those for you in just a moment. But first, the greater context is that King Saul has grown jealous of David and fears that David is going to take his throne. And so he is seeking to take David's life. And as David flees from Saul, running away for his life, what happens? Well, he ends up in Philistine territory. And the Philistines bring him before their king. So let me read that account to you. And David rose, and fled that day from Saul, and went to Achish the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, Is not this David the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And David took these words to heart, and was much afraid of Achish the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them, and pretended to be insane in their hands, and made marks on the doors of the gate, and let his spittle run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, Behold, you see the man is mad. Why then have you brought him to me? Do I lack madmen, that you have brought this fellow to behave as a madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? This is also the word of the Lord. Now, I don't believe this is a good account. David pretends, he lies, he puts forward a falsehood that really doesn't match with the words of this psalm. So has David prayed this, sung this hymn prior to the events with the Philistines, as they have captured him, but he has not yet been brought before the king? Is he singing this in his mind? Is he praying this prayer as he sits before the king as a madman? Or is this in the aftermath? that David is recognizing that really the Lord can care for him no matter what. The thing is, David should have recognized it even from what they said. He's afraid. He comes into the camp of the Philistines here terrified because they recognize who he is. They know what he's done. That is, he's killed 10,000s. What's wrong with that? Well, those tens of thousands he's killed mostly have been Philistines. Now the Philistines have him. What might they do to him? But that very thing, the same thing that was causing him fear, should have been his comfort. David didn't kill all those Philistines on his own. The Lord fought for him, just like when he fought against Goliath, the Philistine champion. Goliath was also from Gath, by the way, but David didn't stand a chance in that fight. God fought. God won. If the Lord wanted to rescue David from the hands of the Philistines, he could do that whether David was sound of mind or not. So David's pretending here seems to be not good in my view of things, but at the same time the Lord is still faithful, and that's a great comfort to us. Because how often are we fully faithful to the Lord, always trusting in his provision and care, and not trying to take it back for ourselves and do things our own way? And yet to know that even in the midst of that the Lord would care for us, provide for us, forgive us, and rescue us. This is good news. So David prays. He prays for God's grace, that the Lord would care for him. Man tramples me all day long, an attacker oppresses me. So he was running from one enemy, and he simply ran right into the hands of another. All day long, from every side, it feels the enemy is against him. They attack me proudly, stirring up their own mind, their own might. There's not a humbleness, a humility to this. But they think themselves so great. Saul is the king, Philistines thinking they have their enemy. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. And this again leads me to think that this is afterwards, that David is recognizing that the Lord cared for him anyway. The Lord delivered him from the hands of his enemies in Gath. And Gath, by the way, I forgot to say, is probably about 30 miles west of Jerusalem and then just a little south. So it's not too far away from where David would someday call his capital. I love verse 4. In God whose word I praise. So David is going to sing God's praises. He's thanking God for what he's done and how he's cared for him. In God I trust. I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? Now there are a series of 4 rhetorical questions, in a way, in this psalm. My encouragement as a family would be just to talk about these questions together. What can man do to me? Why is it that David need not be afraid? Which, again, is an indicator this happens after his encounter with the Philistines. Because during it he was afraid. But now he's recognizing he need not be. What can the enemy do to me? This is quoted by the unknown preacher to the Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 6. He says, so we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me? It is a profound truth. The enemy can torture me, and I'm still in Christ. They can draw out my pain for days upon days, but it is a blink of an eye compared to eternity in paradise. They can put me to death. They can draw blood from my veins, but Christ will raise me up. Such strength that we can have in our faith, such confidence, because we know that the Lord is for us. All day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. So he goes back to speaking of the enemy, that they seek to injure his cause. David's cause, if we're putting this most faithfully, is to serve the Lord and to care for his people. And so Saul is seeking to prevent that. The Philistines are seeking to prevent that. Their thoughts against David are to do him harm and not good. So that's fitting. They stir up strife, they lurk, they watch his steps, waiting for his life. They're trying to cause trouble around him. They're trying to do anything they can to trap him, to harm him. I mean, that doesn't really sound all that much like the Philistines who already had him, but recognizing perhaps of an ongoing nature of the attack of his enemy against him. For their crime will they escape? Again, family conversation, as David asks this question. The answer is no. The Lord is judge. Not one of us will escape the Lord's judgment. The only way out is through Christ, who took that judgment for us. And so these enemies, if they were to know of Christ and his salvation, they also would be forgiven and live. And then in paradise, David would look at them and call them brother. Just as Stephen could be stoned in the presence of Paul, and yet in paradise they are brothers. Stephen would have been among those to welcome Saul home. David then prays, "In wrath cast down the peoples, O God." So he calls out for God's judgment to come, to put an end to his enemies. You have kept count of my tossings, put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? An interesting picture that the Lord is bottling our tears, not for strange purposes, but a remembrance, to see the suffering of his saints, to know the suffering of his people, and to care for them. He knows them, just as he knows the number of hairs on our head, just as he knows the number of days of our lives before we even were yet born. He also knows our pain and our suffering. Are they not in your book? What book this is? It could be the book of life, a reference to all the good deeds that God has done, that Jesus has done, that he has taken away our sin and our suffering and our death. We are the good works of Jesus in that way. Some of the good works, at least. Is it another book? It's hard to say, but the Lord knows, and that's the point, that's the picture. The Lord knows you. The Lord knows your child. And he loves you. He's given himself for you. Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. So when David prays, his enemies will flee because they're fighting God, not against him. So again, the idea of what he's done with Goliath, what he's done to the tens of thousands, recognizing it as the Lord who fights for him. So verse 10, in God whose word I praise, in Yahweh whose word I praise. He continues to thank God for what God has done for him, rescuing him from the hands of all of his enemies. And he repeats then from verse 4, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? Very true. It's a statement worth memorizing as a family with our kids. And that verse, Psalm 56, verse 11. To be able to repeat that to ourselves when trouble comes. To pray and trust that the Lord will provide. I must perform my vows to you, O God. That's a true statement. If he's made a vow, if you make a vow to God, you are to keep it. And Jesus teaches us that we should simply let our yes be yes and our no be no, as he preaches the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. But if David as king has spoken such, he should do it. And then what we should all do in verse 12b is render thanks to God. In David's time, that was through offerings of thanksgiving. In our time, that often is through prayer and singing praise. But he recognizes, verse 13, that God has delivered his soul from death. And so he will walk before God in the light of life. And that certainly reminds me of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is the light of the world, and who gives us life, that we may live with him, walking before him forevermore.